The diner sat at the edge of the highway, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the cold night air. Marlene's Diner, open 24 hours, it boasted. Truckers loved it, locals tolerated it, and passersby found it convenient. Tonight, though, it was nearly empty, except for a few stragglers and one waitress, Janet, who had the misfortune of working the graveyard shift. Janet didn't mind the hours. She liked the quiet. The night was predictable. A few drunk college kids looking for greasy food, a trucker or two refueling before continuing their haul, and maybe the occasional insomniac nursing coffee until dawn. But this night would change her life forever. It started with the wind. Fierce gusts rattled the windows, and the hum of the old HVAC system became a mournful wail. Around midnight, a man came in. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, and his clothes were slightly too big, as if he'd been losing weight fast. Janet greeted him with her usual forced cheer, but he didn't respond. Instead, he slid into the corner booth and stared at the menu, not turning a single page. Janet approached cautiously, holding her notepad. "Anything I can get started for you?" she asked. The man didn't look up. "Coffee," he rasped. His voice was dry and cracked, like he hadn't used it in days. She nodded and went to get his drink. When she returned, he was still staring at the menu, unmoving. She placed the steaming mug in front of him and tried again. "Ready to order?" This time he looked up, and Janet felt her stomach drop. His face, illuminated by the buzzing overhead lights, was gaunt and pale, his cheeks sunken. His eyes were so hollow they seemed to pull her in. But the most unsettling part? The faint outline of handprints around his neck, like he'd been strangled, or had strangled someone. "Not hungry," he muttered, then returned his gaze to the menu. Janet backed away, trying to suppress her unease. She dealt with her fair share of odd customers, people on drugs, people having breakdowns, people running from something. It came with the job. But this man, he felt wrong. The air around him felt heavy, suffocating. An hour passed, and he hadn't touched his coffee. He hadn't moved at all. Janet busied herself wiping counters and restocking napkins, stealing glances at him. Every time she swore his position had shifted slightly, even though she hadn't seen him move. The other patrons trickled out, leaving the diner empty except for the man in the corner. At 2:13 a.m., the door chimed, and a young woman entered. She was drenched from the rain that had started pouring outside, her blonde hair plastered to her face. She looked panicked, her eyes darting around the diner before landing on Janet. "Please," she whispered, clutching the counter. "Can I use your phone?" Janet handed it over without question. The woman's hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial. She turned her back to the man in the corner, who hadn't reacted to her arrival. Janet pretended to clean while eavesdropping. "It's me," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I think he's here. I don't know if he saw me, but..." She froze, her eyes widening as she glanced over her shoulder. The man was staring at her. Janet's stomach twisted into knots. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" she asked, trying to sound calm. The woman didn't answer. She hung up the phone, shoved it back toward Janet, and bolted for the door. Before she could reach it, the man was already standing. It was impossible. Janet hadn't seen him move. He was just there, blocking the exit. "Leave me alone," the woman screamed, backing away. "I know what you are." The diner lights flickered, and the air grew icy. Janet's breath fogged in front of her, and she felt a primal terror clawing at her chest. The man tilted his head, a grotesque, unnatural motion that made his neck pop loudly. "You can't run from me," he whispered, his voice echoing as though it came from the depths of a cave. The woman turned and sprinted toward the kitchen. Janet wanted to follow, to help, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. The man's head snapped toward her, and for a moment their eyes met. She felt a wave of nausea and fear so intense that she thought she might faint. His lips curled into a chilling grin, and then he disappeared into the kitchen after the woman. Janet heard the sounds of a struggle, screaming, pots and pans clattering, something heavy hitting the floor, and then silence. She didn't dare move. Her hand fumbled for her cell phone under the counter, but when she looked down, it was gone. A low growl filled the diner, and the lights went out completely. In the pitch black, she heard slow, deliberate footsteps approaching, closer and closer until she could feel hot breath on her face. The lights flickered back on. The diner was empty. The man, the woman, The only sign they'd been there at all was the overturned coffee mug in the corner booth, the liquid dripping onto the floor. Janet quit her job the next morning. No one believed her story. The woman's face eventually appeared on the news. She'd been missing for weeks, her body found in a shallow grave just a few miles from the diner. As for the man, Janet never saw him again. But sometimes when she drives past the old diner, now boarded up and abandoned, she swears she sees a figure in the corner booth, staring out at her with hollow eyes. Casey's Diner was one of those old-school places that seemed frozen in time. A checkerboard floor, red vinyl booths, and a jukebox that hadn't worked in decades gave it a nostalgic charm. For Emily, the new waitress, it seemed like an easy gig. Midnight shifts, decent tips from truckers, and an endless supply of coffee to keep her awake. Her manager, Pete, gave her a single rule: never go into the basement. Pete's warning came with a chuckle, so Emily didn't think much of it. She assumed it was just some old storage area full of junk. Still, every so often, she caught Pete glancing at the basement door, his expression tight, as if he were waiting for it to move. The first few nights passed uneventfully, save for the occasional drunk wandering in and ordering pancakes. But her fourth night was different. At around 2:30 a.m., the diner was empty. Emily leaned on the counter, scrolling through her phone when she heard it. A faint thump. She froze, listening. Another thump. It was coming from the basement door. "Pete?" she called out, even though she knew he'd gone home hours ago. No answer. Emily forced a laugh, telling herself it was just the old building settling, but the thumps became louder, more rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the other side. She stepped toward the door, hesitating. "Hello?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then a long, drawn-out scraping noise, like nails dragging across wood. Emily backed away. She grabbed her phone, ready to call Pete, when the door handle began to rattle violently. "Is someone down there?" she shouted, trying to sound braver than she felt. The rattling stopped. Heart pounding, Emily decided to call the police. But just as she unlocked her phone, the basement door creaked open, revealing a staircase descending into pitch darkness. She stared at it, her phone forgotten in her hand. Something compelled her to move closer, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. At the top of the stairs, she peered into the blackness. The faint smell of damp earth wafted up, mixed with something metallic, something like blood. She called again, her voice trembling. This time, a whisper floated up from the darkness. "Help me." It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably human. "Who's there?" she demanded. "Help me," the voice repeated. Desperate now. Emily hesitated. She wanted to run, to pretend she hadn't heard anything, but what if someone was really trapped down there? Against her better judgment, she grabbed the flashlight Pete kept under the counter and started down the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell grew stronger. The beam of the flashlight illuminated dusty shelves, broken chairs, and old diner equipment. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice echoing. "Here," the voice whispered. She turned the corner, and the light fell on something that made her stomach drop. A man sat in the far corner, his back to her. His clothes were tattered, and his head hung low, as if he didn't have the strength to lift it. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, stepping closer. The man didn't respond. As she approached, her flashlight flickered, and for a split second, she thought she saw something moving behind him, something tall with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. But when the light steadied, it was gone. "Sir?" she repeated, her voice cracking. The man's head jerked up, and he turned to face her. Emily screamed. His face was a grotesque mask of decay, his eyes hollow sockets oozing black ichor, his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing jagged, rotting teeth. "Help me," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally, like multiple voices speaking at once. The flashlight went out completely. In the pitch darkness, Emily heard the sound of shuffling, like something dragging itself toward her. She stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. Her hands frantically searched for the stairs, but the air was freezing now, and her breath came out in shaky puffs. "Help? Me?" The voice whispered again, this time right next to her ear. Emily bolted up the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground. She slammed the basement door shut and locked it, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the key. The diner was silent again, but she could still feel it, that heavy, oppressive presence pressing against the other side of the door. She didn't wait to find out if it would follow her. Grabbing her bag, she ran out of the diner and didn't stop until she was safe inside her car. Emily quit the next day. Pete didn't seem surprised. When she asked him about the basement, he just shook his head. "You don't want to know," he said. The diner burned down 2 weeks later. The fire marshal ruled it as electrical, but Emily heard rumors. Some said it wasn't a fire at all. That one night, the basement door opened and something came out. Something that wasn't meant to be set free. Charlie's Diner wasn't anything special, just a roadside spot off Route 23 that served greasy burgers and watery coffee. It was the kind of place where truckers and locals mingled, and where regulars rarely had to order because the staff already knew what they wanted. For Sam, the owner, that predictability was comforting. Until the night he walked in. It was early October, the kind of chilly night where the mist hangs low over the asphalt. The usual crowd had filtered out, leaving only a few stragglers nursing coffee and pie. Sam was behind the counter, wiping it down when the door opened. The man who entered was tall and lean, his face hidden beneath the brim of a battered hat. His clothes were odd, not old-fashioned exactly, but not quite modern either. He walked to the farthest booth, the one tucked in the corner where the lights flickered occasionally, and sat down without a word. Sam grabbed a menu and approached, forcing a polite smile. "Evening. What can I get you?" The man didn't look up. His voice was low, gravelly, and cold. "Just coffee." Sam nodded and walked back to the counter, a strange unease settling over him. As he poured the coffee, he realized something odd. The man's boots were caked in dried mud, and his hands, resting on the table, looked almost too long, the fingers slightly misshapen. When Sam returned with the coffee, the man was staring out the window, even though there was nothing to see but darkness. He didn't acknowledge Sam, just reached for the mug. "Let me know if you need anything else," Sam said, his voice trailing off. The man stayed silent. Over the next hour, the diner emptied. The last customer, a trucker who tipped generously, left, leaving only Sam and the stranger. Sam tried to stay busy, wiping tables and checking inventory, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he glanced toward the corner booth, the man was still there, sitting impossibly still. At 2:47 a.m., the man finally spoke. "Busy night?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. Sam looked up from the register. "Not really. Slows down around this time." The man nodded, his face still obscured by the hat's shadow. "Ever have strange things happen here?" Sam frowned. "Strange how?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he lifted his head slightly, just enough for Sam to catch a glimpse of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, they weren't quite human. The irises were too large, the color too dark, and they seemed to shimmer, as if reflecting some unseen light. Sam felt a chill creep up his spine. "People disappearing," the man said finally. "Things showing up where they don't belong." Sam forced a nervous laugh. "Can't say I've seen much of that." The man tilted his head, studying Sam. "Not yet." Before Sam could respond, the lights flickered, plunging the diner into brief darkness. When they came back on, the man was gone. The coffee cup sat on the table, untouched, a $5 bill tucked neatly underneath it. Sam didn't sleep well that morning. The second visit. The following night, the man returned. Same booth, same silent presence. This time, Sam didn't approach right away. He watched from the counter, noticing how the man didn't seem to blink, didn't seem to move at all. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the man spoke again. "Have you seen it yet?" Sam froze. "Seen what?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of grin that made your stomach churn, wide and unnatural. "You'll know soon enough." As if on cue, the lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on. The diner was plunged into total darkness, and Sam heard it, a soft tapping on the glass coming from the large front window. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice trembling. No response, just the steady tap, tap, tap. Sam reached for the flashlight he kept under the counter and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the window. There was nothing there. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sam turned the flashlight toward the booth where the man had been sitting. It was empty. The coffee cup, however, was floating, hovering a few inches above the table, spinning slowly in midair. Sam's breath caught, and he stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Sam could hear something moving in the dark, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, circling him. "Who's there?" he shouted, panic overtaking him. A voice whispered in his ear, so close he could feel the cold breath on his skin. "Look outside." Sam didn't want to, but something compelled him to obey. He turned the flashlight back to the window, and this time, he saw it. A face, but it wasn't human. The thing staring back at him had hollow, sunken eyes and a gaping mouth filled with jagged teeth. Its skin was mottled and decayed, stretched tightly over its skull. It pressed its hands against the glass, with long fingers clawing at the surface as if trying to get in. Sam screamed, dropping the flashlight. When the lights came back on, the diner was empty. The booth was spotless, no sign of the man or the coffee cup, but on the window, written in long, jagged letters, was a single word: soon. Sam closed the diner the next day and never reopened. Locals say the building still stands, abandoned and decaying, but if you drive past it late at night, you might see a figure sitting in the corner booth, waiting. And if you stop to look closer, you'll hear the faint sound of tapping on the glass. It was supposed to be an easy gig, 1 week of night shifts at a small off-highway diner while the regular staff was on vacation. Jess was a college student desperate for cash, and the manager, Donna, seemed nice enough. The place was quiet, with just a few truckers and travelers stopping by each night. But Donna had been clear about one rule: don't serve anyone who comes in after 3:15 a.m. I'm offhand. Jess had laughed at the odd specificity of the rule, but Donna's face had remained grim. "I mean it," Donna said. "Lock the doors if you have to. Don't let them in." Jess shrugged it off. Small town superstitions, she figured. Her first night was uneventful. A couple of truckers stopped in for coffee and pie. A tired family ordered pancakes to go, and by 3 a.m. the place was empty. At 3:14 a.m. she glanced at the clock, Donna's warning lingering in her mind. At exactly 3:16 a.m. the door jingled. A man entered, tall and gaunt, wearing a threadbare suit that looked decades out of fashion. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were sunken, surrounded by deep, dark circles. Jess hesitated behind the counter. She wanted to greet him, but something about him froze the words in her throat. "Coffee," the man said, his voice soft, but carrying a strange, hollow quality. Jess glanced at the clock. 3:17 a.m. She remembered Donna's warning and forced a nervous smile. "I'm sorry, but the kitchen's closed." The man didn't move, didn't blink. His gaze locked onto hers, and Jess felt a chill run through her. "Coffee," he repeated, his tone firmer. Jess felt the air grow heavy, like the room was pressing in around her. She stepped back, her hand brushing against the phone. "Sir, I really can't." The man leaned forward, placing his hands on the counter. His nails were cracked and yellowed, his fingers unnaturally long. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and sharp. "I need it." Jess's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. "I can't help you," she stammered. For a moment, the man simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he straightened and turned toward the door. As he walked out, Jess felt the pressure in the room lift. She locked the door behind him and spent the rest of the night trembling. The second night. The next night, Jess told herself she'd imagined it. Stress, fatigue, there had to be a logical explanation. At 3:16 a.m., the door jingled again. It wasn't the same man. This time it was a woman. Her hair was disheveled, her dress torn, and her bare feet left faint muddy prints on the tile floor. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "I just need water." Jess froze. She remembered Donna's rule, but the woman looked desperate, terrified. "I'm not supposed to." "Please," the woman interrupted, stepping closer. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, her hands trembling. "They'll know if I don't?" She stopped mid-sentence, her gaze snapping to the window. Her face twisted in fear. "They're here," she whispered. Jess followed her gaze but saw nothing outside except the empty parking lot. When she turned back, the woman was gone. The door hadn't opened. Jess didn't sleep that day. The final night. On her last night, Jess was determined to stick to the rule. She locked the doors at 3:10 a.m. and tried to distract herself with cleaning. At 3:16 a.m., a soft knock came at the door. She ignored it, scrubbing at an already clean table. The knock came again, louder this time. "Please," a voice called. "I need your help." It was a child. Jess's stomach twisted. She peered through the blinds and saw a little boy standing outside. He couldn't have been older than 8, wearing pajamas smeared with dirt. His face was streaked with tears. "Please," he said again, his voice muffled through the glass. They're after me. Jess felt tears prick her eyes. Every instinct screamed at her to let him in, to protect him, but Donna's warning rang in her head. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. The boy's expression shifted. His eyes darkened, and his lips curled into a grotesque grin far too wide for his face. You'll regret this, he said, his voice no longer a child's. Jess stumbled back, her heart hammering. The boy slammed his hands against the glass, the sound echoing through the empty diner. His face twisted further, his features stretching and distorting into something inhuman. And then, just as suddenly, he was gone. Jess didn't finish her shift. She grabbed her things and ran, vowing never to return. The aftermath. A week later, Jess heard the news. The diner had burned down in the middle of the night. Investigators found no clear cause, but they did find something strange. The clock above the counter had stopped at exactly 3:16 a.m. The Phantom Cook Ruby's Diner was a small, family-owned spot that had been serving greasy breakfasts and late-night snacks for decades. It wasn't much to look at, cracked linoleum floors, flickering neon sign, but it was a beloved fixture for locals and weary travelers. The diner had one quirk, the back kitchen. It was old, cramped, and carried an oppressive atmosphere. Staff avoided it whenever possible, preferring the smaller cooking station out front. Ruby, the owner, insisted on keeping it locked unless the diner was packed, which rarely happened these days. When Michael, the new hire, asked Ruby why the back kitchen was avoided, she just shrugged. It's just bad vibes, she said, her tone clipped. Don't worry about it. But Michael couldn't help himself. He noticed how the other employees would glance nervously at the locked door, and how Ruby always made sure to lock it at the end of every shift. He should have left well enough alone. A busy night. One Friday night, the diner was unusually crowded. Ruby had stepped out to run errands, leaving Michael and two waitresses to handle the growing rush. By 10 p.m., the griddle up front wasn't enough to keep up with the orders. We're falling behind, one of the waitresses groaned. Michael made a decision. He grabbed the keys Ruby kept in the register and unlocked the back kitchen. The door swung open, revealing an eerily pristine cooking space. Unlike the rest of the diner, the back kitchen looked almost untouched. The counters gleamed, the stovetop was spotless, and the air smelled faintly of old grease, though no one had cooked there in years. Michael got to work, throwing burgers on the grill and heating up pans of soup. He was too busy to notice the temperature drop or the faint hum in the air, like static building. By the time Ruby returned, the rush had died down, and the customers were content. Michael grinned proudly. I opened the back kitchen, he said, expecting praise. Instead, Ruby went pale. You what? She hissed. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen door, now slightly ajar. It's fine, Michael said, confused by her reaction. Everything's clean. A loud clang cut him off. It came from the back kitchen. Ruby froze. Did you lock the door after you were done? She asked, her voice tight. Michael shook his head. Ruby grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. We're leaving. Now. What? Now. As she dragged him toward the exit, the lights flickered, plunging the diner into brief darkness. When they came back on, the air was thick with the smell of burning meat, though nothing was on the griddle. Ruby swore under her breath and pulled Michael outside. She locked the diner door behind them, her hands shaking. You're lucky it's not midnight yet, she muttered. What are you talking about? Michael demanded. Ruby didn't answer. The midnight shift. Michael couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business. Ruby had sent everyone home early and locked up the diner, but Michael returned later that night, determined to prove she was overreacting. He broke in through the back door and made his way to the kitchen. Everything was quiet, the diner dimly lit by the glow of the neon sign outside. The back kitchen door was wide open. Michael frowned. He was sure Ruby had locked it. As he stepped inside, the static hum returned, louder this time, making the hairs on his arms stand up. The room was icy cold and the smell of grease had turned rancid. And then he heard it. The scrape of a knife against a cutting board. Michael's blood ran cold. He turned toward the counter and froze. A figure stood there, hunched over, moving methodically. It wore a stained apron and a white chef's hat, its face obscured by long, greasy hair. The figure's hands were impossibly pale, almost skeletal, and they moved with unnatural speed as it chopped something on the cutting board. Hello? Michael said, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Michael took a step closer, his curiosity battling his fear. The thing on the cutting board wasn't vegetables or meat. It was unrecognizable, dark and wet, pieces of it twitching as the knife struck. "Hey!" Michael shouted, trying to sound brave. The figure stopped. It turned its head slowly, unnaturally, until its face was visible. Michael wished he hadn't looked. The face was a hollow, gaping void, as if its features had been erased. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep, empty sockets. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. The figure stepped toward him, dragging the knife along the counter, the screeching sound making Michael's ears ring. He bolted. As he ran, the sound of the knife scraping against surfaces followed him, growing louder, closer. He burst out of the diner and didn't stop running until he was back in his car, shaking uncontrollably. The aftermath. The next morning, Ruby found him sitting outside the diner, pale and trembling. She didn't need to ask what had happened. "You let it out," she said quietly. Michael stared at her, unable to form words. Ruby sighed and unlocked the door, muttering a prayer under her breath. When she stepped inside, the back kitchen door was shut, but the faint sound of chopping echoed through the diner. Michael never returned to Ruby's diner, but locals still talk about it. Some say you can see the chef late at night, moving behind the windows, its hollow face staring out at the road. Others say they've heard the scraping of a knife when driving past, but no one who enters after midnight ever comes back to tell the tale. The customer who never ate Mary's diner was a relic from the 1950s, a shiny silver box on the edge of a quiet town. It had survived decades of change, remaining mostly unchanged itself. Mary, the owner, loved her diner, but couldn't deny its eerie quirks: strange cold spots, flickering lights, and the occasional customer who swore they heard whispers when no one was around. But the strangest thing of all was the customer. He first showed up one snowy November night. The wind howled outside, the roads were slick with ice, and Mary was about to close early when the door chimed. A man walked in wearing an old black coat that looked soaked despite the dry snow outside. He was tall and thin, with a pale, gaunt face and deep-set eyes. "Evening," Mary greeted, trying to hide her surprise. The man nodded but didn't speak. He slid into the booth farthest from the door, where the light above flickered constantly. Mary brought him a menu, but he didn't even look at it. "Coffee," he said, his voice low and hoarse. She poured him a cup and left him alone, figuring he was just another weary traveler. But the man never touched the coffee. He sat there for hours, staring out the window at the snowstorm. At 2 a.m., Mary finally approached him. "We're closing up soon," she said. The man turned his hollow gaze on her, his lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. "I'll be gone before you lock the doors," he said, and he was. When she turned to clean the counter, the man disappeared. His coffee cup was still full, and the chair hadn't made a sound as he left. The repeat visits. The man returned the next night, and the night after that. He always ordered coffee. He never drank it. He always sat in the same booth under the flickering light. Mary began to notice other oddities. The temperature around his booth was always colder than the rest of the diner. The clock above the counter slowed down when he was there, its second hand ticking sluggishly. And then there was the mirror. One night, Mary caught her reflection in the diner's long mirror behind the counter and froze. The man wasn't there. His booth was empty, but when she turned to look at it, he was sitting right there, staring out the window as always. Her reflection didn't lie, the disappearance. By the fourth night, Mary was growing uneasy. She confided in Pete, the local sheriff, who often stopped by for pie. "That man creeps me out," she admitted. "He's been here every night this week, just sitting there, doesn't even drink his coffee." Pete chuckled. "Maybe he's just lonely." Mary frowned. "He doesn't show up in the mirror." Pete stopped mid-bite, his face growing serious. "What do you mean?" she explained, and Pete promised to swing by later that night to keep her company. When the man showed up at midnight, Pete was already there, sipping his coffee at the counter. The sheriff watched him carefully, noting the way his movements seemed almost too slow, too deliberate. At 1:45 a.m., Pete got up and approached the man. "Hey there," he said. "Mind if I ask where you're from?" The man slowly turned to face him. His eyes were so dark they seemed to absorb the light bar, and his thin lips twisted into that faint smile. "Far away," he said simply. Pete pressed on. "What brings you here?" The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed unnaturally sharp. "I'm waiting." "For what?" The man didn't answer. Pete placed his hand on the table, leaning closer. Listen, buddy, you're making people uncomfortable. Maybe it's time to move along. The man stared at Pete's hand, his expression blank. You don't belong here either, he said softly. Pete's hand shot back as if he'd been burned. He glanced down and saw his skin had turned an angry red as if frostbitten. At that moment, the lights flickered and the temperature in the diner plummeted. The man stood, towering over Pete, and turned his empty gaze on Mary. It's almost time, he said. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, then stopped at 2 a.m. The man vanished. The truth. Pete insisted on driving Mary home that night, and neither of them spoke about what had happened. But the next morning, Pete returned with news. He had looked into the diner's history and discovered that the man fit the description of a traveler who had died nearby in the 1950s. His car had skidded off the icy road and into the ravine just past the diner. Locals said he'd been trying to get to Mary's diner, but never made it. Some said his ghost had been spotted over the years, they always waiting for something, or someone. Mary was too shaken to return to work that night, so Pete agreed to keep watch. At 2 a.m. sharp, the door chimed, and the man appeared again. This time, he didn't sit. He walked straight to Pete, his movements smooth and unnatural. You shouldn't be here, the man whispered. Pete tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The man raised one hand, pointing toward the counter. Pete turned, following his gaze, and saw his own reflection in the mirror. It wasn't him. The figure in the mirror wore Pete's uniform and face, but its eyes were hollow, its skin pale, and its smile too wide. When Pete turned back, the man was gone. Pete never spoke of that night again. Mary sold the diner the following month, but locals say the new owners have had trouble keeping staff. They say the man still shows up, sitting in his booth, staring out the window, waiting. Mark was a truck driver, used to long nights on the road and endless stretches of empty highway. He prided himself on knowing all the best spots to stop. Diners with strong coffee, decent pie, and clean restrooms. So when he spotted a diner he didn't recognize on a stretch of road he'd traveled 100 times, he was intrigued. The neon sign read, Darla's Diner, always open. It flickered faintly in the misty darkness, and the place looked like a postcard from the 1970s. Chrome siding, checkered tile floor visible through the window, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Mark pulled into the empty parking lot. The diner shouldn't have been there. Inside, the place was eerily quiet, though it was clean and brightly lit. A jukebox in the corner played a faint tune, something soft and indistinct. A waitress appeared seemingly out of nowhere, smiling brightly. She wore a pink uniform with a white apron, her hair pinned into perfect curls. Her name tag read Darla. Welcome to Darla's Diner, she said. What'll it be? Mark hesitated. There were no other customers, and he hadn't seen any cars outside. Still, he figured a cup of coffee and a slice of pie wouldn't hurt. Coffee and whatever pie you've got, he said, sliding into a booth. Darla's smile didn't falter. Coming right up. As she walked away, Mark glanced around. The diner was spotless, but it felt off. The clock on the wall didn't seem to move, and the air had a strange heaviness to it. When Darla returned with his order, Mark noticed something odd. Her reflection in the chrome napkin holder was faint, like a smudge of smoke. He tried not to stare. The second morning. The coffee was bitter but hot, and the pie, cherry, was surprisingly good. As Mark ate, he became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. The jukebox music had stopped. The silence pressed in, broken only by the faint buzz of the lights. Mark glanced toward the counter and froze. Darla was standing there, perfectly still, her head slightly tilted, staring at him. Her smile was gone. Mark cleared his throat. The pie's great. Darla didn't respond. He shifted uncomfortably, then noticed something else. The front windows, which had shown the parking lot when he arrived, now reflected only darkness. No mist, no truck, no diner sign, just black. Everything okay? Mark asked, his voice cracking slightly. Darla's head snapped upright, her smile returning like a mask. Glad you like it, she said brightly, as if nothing had happened. Mark decided it was time to leave. The third warning. He threw a few bills on the table and stood to go, but the moment he reached the door, he realized it wouldn't budge. It's always open, Darla said behind him. Her tone was cheerful, but there was a coldness to her words now. Mark turned to face her. She stood in the center of the diner, her hands clasped in front of her, her smile frozen and unnatural. I need to get back on the road. he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Darla tilted her head again, her eyes unblinking. But you just got here. The air grew colder, and Mark's breath puffed in front of him. The lights dimmed slightly, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Mark's heart raced. He bolted for the kitchen, thinking he might find a back exit, but what he found stopped him cold. The truth. The kitchen was wrong. The walls were lined with rusted industrial equipment that looked decades out of use. The stench of burnt meat filled the air, and the floor was sticky with something that looked too dark to be grease. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay a half-eaten pie. The filling wasn't cherry. It was something darker, with a texture Mark didn't want to identify. Footsteps echoed behind him. Mark turned and saw Darla standing in the doorway, her shadow stretching impossibly long behind her. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice distorted, layered with other voices. Mark backed away, his hand brushing against something cold and metal. A knife. Without thinking, he grabbed it and swung wildly. The blade passed through Darla as if she were made of smoke. Her form flickered, and for a brief moment, Mark saw something else. A twisted skeletal figure with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, grinning inhumanly wide. The lights in the kitchen flickered violently, plunging the room into strobe-like chaos. Mark didn't wait to see what happened next. He ran, slamming into walls and counters until he burst through a door, only to find himself outside, standing in the empty parking lot. The aftermath. His truck was there, engine idling just as he'd left it. Mark didn't question it. He jumped in and sped off, not stopping until he reached a gas station miles down the road. Shaking, he told the attendant about the diner. The man frowned. "Darla's Diner?" he said. "That place burned down 30 years ago. Electrical fire. Killed the owner and some customers. Tragic thing." Mark felt his blood turn to ice. He never drove that route again. But late at night on misty roads, some travelers swear they've seen the flickering neon sign for Darla's Diner. Some even stop. They're never heard from again. Jimmy's Grill was the kind of place that looked alive only after dark. It sat on the outskirts of town, nestled between an abandoned gas station and a stretch of woods so thick the moonlight couldn't pierce it. Truckers and night owls loved it for its 24/7 service and greasy, satisfying food. But there was one unspoken rule: never order the late-night special. The item wasn't listed on the menu, but regulars claimed the cooks would make it if you asked, though none would say what it was. The diner's old-timers would shudder at the mention, muttering about bad luck and things you can't unsee. Danny, a cocky college kid driving through town on his way back to campus, wasn't the type to heed warnings. He had a taste for adventure, a love for dares, and a belief that most spooky stories were just tall tales meant to keep people entertained. So, when he stopped at Jimmy's Grill one foggy night, hungry and bored, he decided he was going to try the infamous late-night special, the Order. The diner was nearly empty when Danny walked in. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, scribbling in a notepad, and a cook could be heard humming off-key in the kitchen. "Coffee?" the waitress asked without looking up. "Sure," Danny said as he slid into a booth. He scanned the menu but didn't see anything unusual. When the waitress returned with his coffee, he leaned back in his seat, flashing a cocky grin. "I'll have the late-night special." The waitress froze, her hand tightening around the coffee pot. Her eyes darted to the kitchen door, and for the first time she really looked at him. "You don't want that," she said, her voice low. Danny laughed. "Come on, what's the big deal? I'm starving." The waitress hesitated, then sighed. "Your funeral." She slipped into the kitchen, she slipped a between knives, and the humming stopped abruptly. Danny heard muffled voices, but he couldn't make out the words. When the waitress returned, her face was pale and her hands trembled slightly as she refilled his coffee. "It's coming," she said simply. Danny smirked. "Can't wait." The arrival. When the plate arrived, it looked normal. A burger sat on the plate, perfectly grilled with a side of golden fries. Steam rose from the food, carrying the tantalizing aroma of fresh beef and fried potatoes. Danny frowned, disappointed. He'd expected something outrageous or weird. "This just looked like diner food. Looks pretty ordinary to me," he said. The waitress didn't reply. She walked away quickly, her shoulders hunched, and disappeared into the back. Shrugging, Danny picked up the burger and took a bite. It was incredible, juicy, flavorful, easily the best burger he'd ever eaten. He devoured it in minutes, barely stopping to chew. The fries were equally perfect, crisp and salty. He was halfway through the fries when he noticed something strange. The diner's atmosphere had changed. The light seemed dimmer, the air heavier, the hum of the refrigerator and the buzz of the neon sign outside were gone, replaced by an unnatural silence. Danny looked around and realized he was alone. The waitress, the cook, even the faint sound of distant traffic, they were all gone. The walls of the diner seemed to shimmer, the shiny chrome surfaces warping like ripples on water. Then he noticed the taste, the change. The fries in his mouth no longer tasted like potatoes. They had a strange metallic tang, and the texture was wrong, gritty and fibrous. Danny spat them out, and his stomach turned as he saw what they really were. They weren't fries. Thin, brittle bones lay on his plate, cracked and splintered. A tiny joint, unmistakably human, was visible in the pile. He gagged, pushing the plate away, but his stomach lurched painfully like it was rebelling against him. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and he doubled over as sharp cramps racked his body. When he looked at his hands, they weren't his hands anymore. The skin was mottled and pale, with deep purple veins crawling like spiderwebs beneath the surface. His nails had turned black and were curling into talons. His reflection in the chrome napkin holder caught his eye. What stared back wasn't Danny. It was a grotesque figure with hollowed cheeks, glowing yellow eyes, and a twisted skeletal grin. The truth. Panicking, Danny stumbled toward the door, but the diner seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit moving farther away with every step. The walls shimmered and the booths warped, turning into grotesque shapes, gnarled limbs and empty faces, frozen in silent screams. He heard voices then, faint whispers rising into a cacophony. You shouldn't have eaten it. Another fool. Trapped. Welcome to the special. The whispers came from everywhere and nowhere. The shadows in the diner moved, coalescing into figures that surrounded him. They were translucent, their forms flickering like static, but their hollow eyes were fixed on him. One stepped closer, its hand outstretched. You're one of us now, Danny screamed, but his voice came out distorted, a guttural wail that didn't sound human. The new special fry. The next morning, Jimmy's grill was open as usual. The waitress, now calm and composed, greeted the regulars and poured coffee. A trucker walked in, rubbing his eyes, and slid into a booth. Got anything good today? He asked. The waitress smiled, glancing toward the kitchen. We've got the late-night special, she said. In the back, a faint hum could be heard as the cook, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, prepared the next plate. The Stardust Diner had seen better days. Once a bustling roadside attraction in the 1960s, it now catered mostly to truckers and the occasional lost tourist. Lucy, the lone waitress on the night shift, had worked there long enough to know its quirks. The flickering lights, the creaky booths, and the strange cold spots that seemed to drift aimlessly around the room. But the booth in the far right corner? That was something else entirely. It was always empty. The owner, a gruff man named Hank, insisted no one sit there no matter how crowded the diner got. That booth's off limits, he'd bark. Don't ask why. Lucy didn't press the issue. Hank was old school, and the diner had enough oddities that one more wasn't worth questioning. But one stormy night, everything changed. Ash, the stranger. The rain was relentless, pounding against the diner's windows in deafening sheets. The neon sign outside buzzed and flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Lucy was cleaning the counter when the door chimed. A man walked in, soaking wet but smiling warmly. Rough night, huh? Lucy said, grabbing a menu. Sure is, he replied, shaking off his coat. Just need some coffee. He glanced around the empty diner and, to Lucy's surprise, headed straight for the forbidden booth. You can't sit there, she called out. The man froze, his smile faltering. Why not? Lucy hesitated. She didn't have an answer. It's just reserved. For who? Before she could respond, the man slid into the booth, tossing his wet coat beside him. Looks like it's free to me. Lucy felt a pang of unease, but forced a smile. Coffee coming right up? As she poured his cup, she noticed something odd. The air around the booth seemed wrong. It was colder there, sure, but it was more than that. The shadows around the man flickered unnaturally, as if the light above him were bending away. She shook off the thought and brought him his coffee. Thanks, he said, sipping it slowly. His gaze drifted toward the window, watching the rain. Let me know if you need anything else, Lucy said, eager to leave the booth behind. As she walked away, she glanced back and froze. The man's reflection in the window wasn't there. The disturbance. The man stayed longer than any customer should, his coffee untouched after that first sip. Lucy tried to keep busy, but she couldn't ignore him. Every time she glanced at the booth, he was staring directly at her, his face calm but unblinking. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, its hands seeming to move slower and slower. At midnight, Lucy decided enough was enough. She marched over to the booth, forcing a smile. "Anything else I can get for you?" The man tilted his head, his eyes studying her intently. "Why is this booth always empty?" Lucy stammered. I don't know. It's just a rule." He leaned forward, his smile returning. "You don't know the story, do you?" "What story?" The man's grin widened. "This booth wasn't always empty. People used to sit here all the time, until the accident." Lucy's stomach tightened. "Accident?" The man nodded. "A family. Late one night, just like this. They were heading home, but the storm was bad, really bad. Their car skidded off the road and crashed right into the diner. This booth was where they were sitting." Lucy's breath caught. She'd never heard about a crash. "But that's not the strange part," the man continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. They didn't die in the crash. They died later, right here." Lucy stepped back, her heart pounding. The man's smile faded and his voice grew cold. "And they're still here, watching, waiting for someone to join them." The overhead lights flickered violently, plunging the diner into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the booth was empty. The man was gone. The aftermath. Lucy searched the diner, but the man had vanished. His coat was still draped over the seat, and his coffee sat untouched, steam rising faintly. She told Hank what had happened when he came in the next morning. His face turned ashen. "I told you," he said, his voice shaking. "No one sits in that booth." Lucy demanded an explanation, and Hank finally relented. "Years ago, a family died there," he admitted. "They were regulars, sat in that booth every Friday night. One stormy night, they were killed in a car crash, but people say they came back. Customers who sat there reported strange things, whispers, cold spots, feeling like they were being watched. A few of them disappeared." Lucy's blood ran cold. "What happened to the ones who disappeared?" she asked. Hank shook his head. "No one knows. Just gone, like they were never here." The final night, Lucy quit a week later, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her every time she passed the booth. But on her last night, curiosity got the better of her. After locking up, she slid into the forbidden booth, daring the unseen presence to do its worst. At first, nothing happened. Then, the air grew heavy, the temperature dropping sharply. The lights dimmed, and a faint sound reached her ears, a whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. She turned to look out the window, and her reflection wasn't there. But the reflection of the man was. His skeletal grin widened as he reached for her. Lucy's scream was never heard. The next morning, the diner was open as usual, the booth empty once more, waiting for its next guest. Marlene had worked the graveyard shift at Penny's Diner for years. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and she liked the quiet. Most nights, the diner saw only a trickle of truckers and weary travelers passing through town. But there was one rule she followed without question. Never lock the doors. It was an odd policy, but the owner, Penny herself, had drilled it into Marlene when she was hired. No matter what, you leave those doors unlocked, even if it's dead quiet, especially if it's dead quiet. Marlene had asked why, but Penny's face had gone pale. "Just don't. Trust me." Marlene figured it had something to do with liability or emergency access. She never pressed further until one night when the quiet became unbearable. The stranger. It was a Tuesday, and the diner was empty, save for Marlene and the hum of the jukebox playing an old Patsy Cline tune. Rain pattered against the windows, the neon open sign buzzing faintly. She was bored out of her mind. She wiped the counter for the 10th time, rearranged the condiments, and checked her phone. Nothing. At 2:13 a.m., the door opened. A man walked in, his clothes soaked through and his boots caked with mud. His face was obscured by the brim of a worn-out hat, but he moved with an unsettling calm. "Coffee," he said, his voice raspy. Marlene nodded, grabbing a mug. She couldn't help but notice his hands. They were pale, almost gray, and his nails were cracked and darkened. "Rough night?" she asked, trying to make small talk. The man didn't respond. He sat at the counter, staring down at the steaming cup of coffee as if it held answers to some unspoken question. Marlene felt a chill creep up her spine. "Anything else?" she asked. "Not yet," he said, his tone cold. For the next hour, the man sat in silence, his coffee untouched. Marlene busied herself cleaning tables, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were on her, even when his head didn't move. At 3 a.m., she heard it, the sound of the diner's front door unlocking on its own. Her head snapped toward the entrance. The door swung open, letting in a blast of icy wind. She rushed over, expecting to see another customer, but there was no one outside. "Strange weather," she muttered, shutting the door and flipping the lock. "No," the man said from the counter. "Don't do that." Marlene turned, her brow furrowing. "Excuse me? Unlock it, now." She crossed her arms, trying to hide her unease. "Why would I do that? No one's out there." The man stood, his movements slow and deliberate, his hat tilted back just enough for Marlene to catch a glimpse of his face, his sunken eyes and a sickly, corpse-like pallor. "Unlock the door," he repeated, his voice a low growl. Marlene's heart raced, but she held her ground. "I don't know who you think you are, but..." The jukebox cut out, plunging the diner into oppressive silence. The man's lips twisted into a grin that sent ice through her veins. "You shouldn't have done that." The visitors. Before Marlene could respond, the lights flickered violently. A loud, metallic scraping noise echoed from outside, like nails dragging across a chalkboard. She glanced out the window and froze. Figures stood just beyond the neon glow, their silhouettes faint in the rain. They didn't move like people, jerky, unnatural motions, as if they were marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Marlene backed away from the door, her stomach churning. What are they?" she whispered. "They're here for you," the man said, his grin widening. "No, they're not," she said, her voice shaking. The figures drew closer, their faces coming into view, pale, hollow-eyed, and twisted with gaping mouths that seemed to stretch too wide. One pressed its face against the glass, its breath fogging the window. Marlene screamed and bolted for the kitchen. "Hash the loop." She slammed the kitchen door shut and grabbed the largest knife she could find. The hum of the fluorescent lights above buzzed louder, almost deafening. The man's voice called out from the diner. "You can't hide forever." Marlene searched for another exit, but the back door wouldn't budge. The walls of the kitchen seemed to warp, bending inward as if the room itself was closing in on her. Then the scraping sound came again. Closer this time, right outside the kitchen door. She held her breath, gripping the knife tightly. The door creaked open, but it wasn't the man. It wasn't the figures. It was the diner. Marlene found herself standing back at the counter, the knife gone from her hands. The jukebox was playing Patsy Cline again, the lights buzzing faintly, and the man was sitting in his seat, staring at his untouched coffee. The door chimed, and Marlene turned to see herself walking in, wiping rain from her jacket. "What the?" she whispered, stepping backward, only to bump into someone. She spun around. It was the man, his grin now inches from her face. "Welcome to your shift," he said. "The endless night." Marlene screamed as the diner dissolved into darkness. When she woke, she was back behind the counter. The clock read 12:01 a.m., and the diner was empty. The door chimed, and a soaking wet man walked in. "Coffee," he rasped. Marlene tried to speak, but her voice was gone. Her body moved on its own, pouring the coffee and sliding it across the counter. As the hours passed, she realized she was trapped, her shift looping endlessly. The door unlocked and opened on its own every night at 3 a.m., the figures outside growing closer with every loop. And no matter how much she begged or screamed, she could never leave. The diner had her now, and it was always open.